Zimbabwe in 1997, a year of economic turning points and the symbolism of the $2 banknote. In 1997, Zimbabwe stood at a pivotal crossroads. What had once been one of the most promising post-colonial African nations began to slide into a series of economic and political crises that would define the coming decades. The $2 Zimbabwean banknote of that year, seemingly an ordinary piece of currency, came to symbolize more than just monetary value. It was a snapshot of a country on the brink of significant transformation, caught between the legacy of its liberation struggle and the harsh realities of mismanagement and economic decline. The late 1990s were supposed to be a period of consolidation and growth for Zimbabwe. Under the leadership of President Robert Mugabe, who had held power since independence in 1980, the nation had initially been lauded for its impressive education and health systems, relative political stability, and functioning economy. However, cracks in this image began to widen as the country grappled with the consequences of years of centralized power, corruption, and ill-fated economic policies. In 1997, Zimbabwe's economy was in a fragile state. After nearly a decade of structural adjustment programs, SAPs, promoted by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, many Zimbabweans were already suffering from high unemployment, reduced government services, and rising inequality. The SAPs, which had been introduced in the early 1990s, aimed to liberalize the economy, cutting government spending, privatizing state enterprises, and opening markets. While they had been intended to modernize Zimbabwe's economy, in practice they resulted in social dislocation and hardship for many citizens, particularly the urban poor. It was against this backdrop that a series of critical events unfolded in 1997, events that would come to be seen as the beginning of Zimbabwe's economic downfall. The most dramatic of these occurred on November 14, 1997, a date that Zimbabweans would come to refer to as Black Friday. On this day, the Zimbabwean dollar lost 72% of its value against the US dollar in a single day of trading. The stock market crashed, and billions of dollars in wealth evaporated almost overnight. This financial catastrophe was triggered by a decision made earlier that year by the Mugabe government: the unbudgeted payout of $4.2 billion to war veterans of Zimbabwe's liberation struggle. This payout, equivalent to 3% of GDP at the time, was granted after months of protest by war veterans led by Shenjerai Hunsby, a vocal and aggressive war veterans leader. The government, under mounting pressure and perhaps fearing a political backlash, agreed to pay each veteran a one-time payment of $50,000 and a monthly pension of $2,000. However, the funds had not been budgeted and had no corresponding revenue source. The announcement sent shockwaves through the financial sector, as investors saw it as a sign of fiscal irresponsibility and unsustainable public spending. The effects were immediate and devastating. Inflation, which had been hovering around 20%, began to climb rapidly. Foreign investors lost confidence and began pulling out. The Zimbabwean dollar, which was still a relatively strong regional currency in the early 1990s, began a long and steady decline. The central bank attempted to intervene, but the damage had already been done. The $2 Zimbabwean note, which circulated widely in 1997, serves as a poignant symbol of this economic turmoil. At face value, the note featured elements designed to inspire national pride: images of Zimbabwe's natural resources, cultural heritage, and infrastructure. It was part of a series that reflected the country's attempt to project economic stability and sovereignty. But by the end of the year, the purchasing power of that $2 note had begun to erode significantly. What could buy a decent meal in early 1997 was barely enough for a loaf of bread by year's end. The note, once a token of everyday commerce, became a reminder of the rapid inflation and economic mismanagement that were taking root. Beyond the economy, 1997 was also a year of increasing political unrest. Labor unions, students, and civic organizations began voicing growing dissatisfaction with the government. Protests and strikes became more common. Although Mugabe's ruling party, ZANU-PF, maintained control, its grip was starting to weaken as cracks appeared within the ruling elite and among former loyalists. The opposition began to find its voice, culminating a few years later in the formation of the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, in 1999. Another critical issue simmering in 1997 was the question of land reform. Land had always been a contentious topic in Zimbabwe. While the country had achieved political independence in 1980, much of the arable land remained in the hands of a small number of white commercial farmers. Although Mugabe's government had implemented limited land redistribution programs in the 1980s and early 1990s, they were slow, bureaucratic, and widely seen as benefiting political elites more than ordinary landless Zimbabweans. By 1997, war veterans and rural populations were growing increasingly impatient. The failure to equitably distribute land was seen as a betrayal of the liberation promises. This discontent would explode into a full-blown land reform crisis just a few years later, but the seeds were already planted in the growing frustration of 1997. Internationally, Zimbabwe's reputation also began to suffer. Donor confidence waned after the veterans' payouts and the growing authoritarian tendencies of the Mugabe government. Western governments and institutions like the IMF began to withhold support or attach stricter conditions to aid. Zimbabwe's alignment with the Democratic Republic of Congo during the Second Congo War in 1998, sending troops at great national expense, further drained the economy and drew criticism. In cultural terms, 1997 still held traces of Zimbabwe's optimistic past. Harare remained a bustling city with a vibrant art scene, music, and intellectual life. But underneath the surface, anxiety was growing. Families began to see the cost of living rise. Wages stagnated while basic goods became more expensive. For the first time, middle-class Zimbabweans started to fear for their financial futures. The poor, especially in rural areas, struggled to access healthcare, education, and employment. By the end of 1997, it was becoming clear to many observers that Zimbabwe was entering a new and more troubled phase of its post-independence history. The $2 banknote from that year, while perhaps just a piece of paper to some, represents a critical moment before hyperinflation, before land seizures, before international isolation, when the country could have chosen a different path. It was a moment of decision, miscalculation, and ultimately decline.